Alaska holds less than 1% of the American population and more than a third of the country's small commercial aircraft accidents. Most of the state has no road running to it. Flying is how Alaskans reach a hospital or the next town over. In weather, the rest of the country would never take off in. These are some of the flights that never arrived. Don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura. 2 weeks before the collision, a Taquan Air Otter came out of monthly maintenance in Ketchikan with a small selector knob on its instrument panel turned to off. A mechanic had moved it, and nobody ever worked out who or why. The knob controlled whether the airplane broadcast its altitude to other aircraft around it. Nothing on the panel flagged the change. The pre-flight checklist had no item for it, and at least one Taquan pilot doubted the knob was connected to anything at all. Ketchikan sits at the southern end of the Alaska Panhandle, a town of about 13,000 that takes in something like 1.25 million cruise passengers a year. The density of air tour traffic over that water is among the highest anywhere in the United States. On the 13th of May 2019, the biggest ship in port was the Royal Princess, and 2 groups off it ended up in the air at the same time. 4 had been talked into a round trip to Misty Fjords by Mountain Air Service, a 2-person outfit run by Randy Sullivan and his wife out of a single de Havilland Beaver built in 1951. The other 10, most of them from one extended family, were booked with Taquan Air on a de Havilland Otter from 1956. Flying it was Lou Beck, 60, a retired Delta captain from Utah who had taken a summer seaplane job because it looked too good to turn down. Both airplanes collected their passengers from a boat at Rudyard Inlet and started the half-hour run back to town. Beck took the long way through the mountains, partly for the view and partly to keep his faster Otter from coming up behind the smaller Beavers heading home in a straight line. At 17 minutes past 12, he checked his traffic display and saw a few distant targets, none of them close enough to matter. He judged himself clear for the next several minutes and turned toward the last stop on the tour, a waterfall above Mahoney Lake on the west side of George Inlet. The display could not have warned him anyway. Its transceiver was never built to compare traffic against a warning envelope, and Beck understood that much without knowing the reason behind it. Sullivan was flying an iPad running ForeFlight, which generates its own alerts without help from the transceiver and was the more capable of the 2 setups. It needed one thing from the Otter to do that, and the knob in the maintenance shop had switched that one thing off. Sullivan leveled at 3,350 feet. Beck came down toward the same altitude from behind and above and to the right, which put the Beaver where its own pilot could not see it, blocked by his wing and by the passenger beside him. Beck's view was blocked by the post next to his windscreen, completely so for the last 11 seconds. And before that, the Beaver would have looked smaller than a thumbnail held at arm's length. A woman in the back of the Otter saw it and shouted at the pilot to pull up, but a bulkhead separated her from the cockpit, and Beck never heard her. In the same moment, a passenger in the Beaver raised a camera and photographed the Otter, filling the window a few meters away, and a second after that, they hit. The Otter's propeller cut through the Beaver's right wing, and its floats broke the fuselage apart. All 5 aboard were thrown into the air, and the wreckage came down across a debris field 900 meters long, with no chance for anyone in it. The Otter snapped hard right, whipped through 180 degrees, pitched down and lost its windscreen. 62 seconds after the collision, Beck flared and put the airplane down, and it went into George Inlet harder than the collision had thrown it. The nose pitched forward, the sea came through the empty windscreen, and the cabin filled within seconds. Beck surfaced through a tangle of wires and debris about 50 meters from shore. 9 passengers got out alive, nearly all with broken or dislocated limbs, and 1 life vest had made it into the water with them. The woman in the front seat had died before the airplane reached the water. The National Transportation Safety Board found that neither pilot could reasonably have seen the other and declined to fault either of them. Had the equipment worked as designed, Sullivan would have been warned 1 minute and 44 seconds ahead of the collision, and Beck 37 seconds ahead. The Aviation Authority reckons a pilot needs 12.5. That Otter had once carried a transceiver capable of driving those alerts, supplied by the government in 2005 under a program meant to make Alaska flying safer. The same agency replaced it in 2015 with a newer unit built to a standard that left the alerting function out. The safety board called it unacceptable that an upgrade could strip a safety feature and still be called one. 15 Ketchikan seaplane companies sat down afterward and agreed on standard routes and common reporting points over the water. Lou Beck was never formally honored for what he did with that airplane, and Taquan Air let him go without saying much about it. At Yakutat, they loaded several hundred pounds of moose meat into the hold. A hunting party had come out of the bush with a good season behind them, and they were flying home with it. which is an ordinary way to travel in Alaska. The airplane was making what everyone up there calls the milk run, a scheduled Boeing 727 working its way down the coast from Anchorage to Seattle, with stops at Cordova, Yakutat, Juneau, and Sitka. It left Yakutat at 25 minutes to 12 on the 4th of September 1971, with 104 passengers and 7 crew. Juneau is a hard airport. The town sits in a trench between water and mountains, and the approach from the west threads a channel with high ground standing on both sides of it. The instrument approach they were cleared for gave them a radio beam to follow left and right, while leaving the vertical entirely up to the crew, who worked their height off a chart and off fixes they identified as they passed them. That day, there was fog over the whole area. They reported passing Barlow intersection, which is where the descent begins, 10 miles west of the field. That was the last transmission anyone received from them. At about 12:15, the airplane flew into the eastern slope of a canyon in the Chilkat Range, at roughly 2,500 feet. It was 18.5 miles west of the airport, which put it 8 miles further out than the crew believed they were, and it was almost perfectly lined up on the localizer beam. Everyone aboard was killed instantly. The cockpit voice recording is the part that stayed with investigators. The crew talked their way down a stabilized approach and sounded satisfied with it, right up to the impact. The beam was giving them accurate guidance left and right, while their sense of how far out they were came from somewhere else entirely. Search crews reached the site by helicopter that afternoon. An Associated Press reporter who flew in described a place that felt like another planet, wrapped in fog and mist, with debris scattered across the slope in pieces small enough that little of it read as an airplane. The National Transportation Safety Board found the probable cause to be a display of misleading navigational information concerning the flight's progress along the localizer course. Where that false information came from, or what its nature was, the board could not determine. Some Alaska Airlines people believed an unusual atmospheric condition over the water had bent the signal, and that the airplane had responded correctly to a reading that was wrong through no fault of anyone in the cockpit. Tests were arranged to reproduce the conditions that would be needed, then the weather refused to cooperate, and they were quietly dropped. The board reopened the file in 1994, confirmed the airplane had definitely received the wrong readings, and again could not say why. The number was 111, which at that moment made it the worst single aircraft accident in American history. It is still the worst Alaska has ever had. In the days afterward, a small airplane deliberately flew the same track west of Juneau. On board was a young engineer named Don Bateman, who had built a device to warn pilots when the ground was coming up in front of them. As his airplane approached the mountain that had taken the 727, the device sounded. The pilot climbed away. Bateman spent the next 30 years pushing that invention into the world, and the ground proximity warning system he developed is now in the cockpit of every airliner flying. Pilots flying into Alaska call the two approaches the front door and the back door. The front door comes in from the northwest onto runway 13, the back door from the southeast onto runway 31. Mountains sit close on both sides, so an airplane has to track in at an angle across the bay and turn onto the centerline very late. The front door is the easier of the two because there is more room between the threshold and the high ground, and most pilots prefer it when the wind allows. Unalaska is a town of about 4,000 people in the eastern Aleutians of Alaska, and it contains Dutch Harbor, the most productive fishing port in the United States. Locals will tell you they are flying to Dutch rather than to Unalaska. On the 17th of October 2019, a Saab 2000 left Anchorage for that airport carrying 39 passengers, among them an entire high school swim team with their chaperones. The captain had 14,000 hours of Alaska flying behind him, and 131 hours on this particular type, which was well short of what his own company required before a captain could land at Unalaska. The chief pilot had waived that requirement when he had 20 hours on the Saab because a merger and a bankruptcy had driven experienced pilots out, and only a handful were still qualified for the airport. The airplane carried a defect that had been sitting there for 2 years. During an overhaul in England in 2017, a mechanic wiring the anti-skid system on the left main landing gear crossed two connections, attaching the outboard wheel sensor to the inboard channel and the inboard sensor to the outboard one. The two harnesses were similar, the labeling was inconsistent, and the design allowed the swap. Every test the manufacturer ran afterward came back clean, because all of them were blind to that particular mistake. The wind at Unalaska moved all afternoon, favoring one runway and then the other, and the crew talked themselves into the approach they knew, Their first attempt ended in a go-around at 300 feet. Circling for a second try, the captain suggested switching to the back door, and the first officer said he had understood they were staying with runway 13. The captain gave way without argument. At 500 feet, the first officer asked whether he was comfortable with it, and the captain said he had been thinking about the other runway, then let it go. 2 minutes from landing, they asked for a final wind check. The observer told them it was blowing from 300 degrees at 24 knots, almost directly behind them, and 9 knots past what the manufacturer allowed. Both men reacted to the number. The first officer asked whether they should back out and go around again. The captain told him to keep talking to weather, and called it their last try. They crossed the threshold with about 15 knots on their tail and touched down at 142 knots over the ground, 1,100 feet in, with 2,800 feet of runway left. The calculations done afterward show that even from there, with working brakes, the airplane stops on the pavement. A bald patch on the left outboard tire caught the asphalt, and the wheel began to skid. The anti-skid computer, reading a sensor that was telling it the wrong wheel, released brake pressure on both inboard wheels instead. The skid continued, so the computer kept releasing pressure until it reached 0. The outboard tire burst, warnings lit the cockpit, and 3/4 of the airplane's braking power was gone. The captain had the pedals to the floor and told the first officer he was sliding, while behind them the flight attendant began welcoming everyone to Dutch Harbor. He steered right to keep away from the water. The airplane went through a chain-link fence and across a ditch in a road, struck a signal post, and stopped with its nose against the rocks of the breakwater. As it tipped, the left landing gear collapsed, and the turning propeller struck stone, tearing the blades off their mountings. 1 went into the bay, and 2 went through the side of the cabin, and one of those destroyed seat 4A and the man sitting in it. It came to rest upright in the next row, wedged between the floor and the overhead bins, inches from other people's legs. The airport's single fire truck arrived in 2 minutes, and a doctor was aboard within 9. Surgeons in Anchorage worked on the injured passenger for as long as they could, and he died of his injuries, the only person killed. The National Transportation Safety Board put the probable cause on the crossed wiring. It also found that the crew's decision to land with that tailwind was intentional and inappropriate, and named the Federal Aviation Administration for approving the Saab 2000 into an airport whose runway safety areas had been built for a smaller and slower class of aircraft. Alaska Airlines ended its code share with the parent company after the report came out. The airline was already $90 million behind on its bills when the pandemic took its passengers away. Caravan Alaska and PenAir both shut down permanently in 2020. A commuter operator in California bought the certificates, put the Caravan name back on the tails, and started flying into Unalaska again in early 2021. Juneau is the only state capital in America that no road reaches. Anyone going there from Anchorage flies or takes a boat, and on the 16th of October 1972, 4 men chose to fly. 3 of them were political. Nick Begich was Alaska's only member of the House of Representatives and was 3 weeks out from an election. Hale Boggs was the House Majority Leader, the second-ranking Democrat in the chamber, and he had come up from Louisiana to campaign for a colleague. The 4th man was an aide to Begich. They were headed for a fundraiser in Juneau, 575 miles down the coast. Boggs had a history that would matter later. He had sat on the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, and by 1972 he had become a public critic of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. The airplane was a Cessna 310, a twin-engine light aircraft owned by a small charter outfit called Pan-Alaska Airways. The pilot was 38 and owned both the airplane and the company. He had roughly 17,000 hours and a reputation in Fairbanks for being very good and very sure of himself. They lifted off Anchorage at 9 in the morning under visual flight rules, filed to follow the airway southeast to the village of Yakutat, and then run direct to Juneau. The usual line takes a pilot over Turnagain Arm and through Portage Pass before crossing Prince William Sound. It is water and mountain the whole way, with almost nothing underneath that a light twin could put down on. The airplane went quiet somewhere along it and stayed quiet. The search that followed was the largest in American history to that point, flown by the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Civil Air Patrol, and civilian volunteers. 400 aircraft covered 325,000 square miles over 39 days, logging 3,602 flight hours between them, and they came back with nothing. On the 24th of November, the air search was called off, and the 4 men were declared dead by the end of December. Alaska state law required the airplane to carry an emergency locator transmitter, a device that switches on at impact and broadcasts a signal for searchers to home in on. Investigators established that this airplane had been flying without one. Weather is the explanation most pilots settle on. That stretch of coast in October produces icing conditions that can load a light twin faster than it can climb, and the man flying had gone down in forced landings twice before, once alone in a single-engine airplane on a brutally cold February day. The counterargument is that his Cessna carried de-icing boots on the wings, which was rare for that model and that year, and the mechanic who worked on it confirmed the equipment decades later. Everything else moved into the space where the wreckage should have been. One theory has the mafia behind it. Another has rogue FBI agents acting on Hoover's orders, on account of what Boggs had been saying about him publicly. A third involves the man who would go on to win Begich's seat. All of it rests on argument alone, because the physical evidence in this case amounts to zero. Congress did the paperwork it had to do. Begich stayed on the ballot because there was no time to remove him, and he won re-election a month after he vanished. The seat was declared empty afterward, and a special election filled it in March. Boggs was replaced in the House by his wife, who became the first woman Louisiana ever sent to Washington and served for nearly 2 decades. What came out of it was a rule. 2 sitting congressmen had gone down with no signal for anyone to follow, and the federal government responded by requiring emergency locator transmitters across most of American general aviation. That is the law that has been finding downed light aircraft ever since. 54 years on, people still walk out into that country looking. Every few years, somebody reports a piece of aluminium in the brush inside the old search box, and the story starts up again for a week. Every piece so far has belonged to something else. The pilot waited 4 hours at Unalakleet for the weather to improve. He sat on the ground in a fishing village on the western edge of Alaska, one of hundreds of communities in that state with no road running to it, watching a front move across Norton Sound, and he did not go until he judged it had eased. Flight 445 lifted off at about 25 minutes to 3 on the 6th of February 2025, bound for Nome with 9 passengers aboard a single-engine Cessna Caravan. It was the last leg of a 3-leg round trip that day. 6 of the passengers were coming home from work in Unalakleet, among them a crew of engineers who had been servicing the village water plant, and a teacher working as a mentor in the school. The airplane was more than 1,000 pounds over the maximum weight it was allowed to carry into known icing. Nobody made that mistake on the afternoon in question. Investigators later pulled the manifests for every flight the airplane had operated in the 10 days before the crash, and found 7 individual legs above the maximum takeoff weight. The pilot had been raising it for a year. His fiancée told investigators he brought it up regularly, that the company wanted him to take more cargo and less fuel, and that he pushed back because an airplane does not fly without fuel. She said Bering Air left it there. 40 minutes out from Unalakleet, the airplane flew into a narrow band of freezing rain and freezing drizzle that was worse than anything forecast. The Caravan carries a system that bleeds fluid through the leading edges of the wing to stop ice forming, and it was overwhelmed almost immediately. Another Bering Air pilot flying the same route that day described ice building in sharp ridges behind the protected surfaces, 1.5 inches thick in places, and called it the worst icing she had ever flown in. Then Nome closed its runway temporarily, and the airplane had to hold. The pilot was now fighting an ice protection system that was losing, while holding an altitude and waiting on an airport, in an airframe carrying more weight than the numbers in front of him assumed. The speed bled off while his attention was somewhere else. The wing stalled, and the inputs he made to recover it took the airplane further from flying. It came down onto the pack ice of Norton Sound, about 34 miles southeast of Nome. The emergency locator transmitter fired on impact and then tore away from its antenna, which left it broadcasting into a disconnected wire. The Coast Guard found the wreck the next day on floating ice. All 10 people aboard had been killed, and the Alaska State Troopers recovered every one of them and brought them into Nome. The National Transportation Safety Board published its final report at the end of July 2026. It put the probable cause on the pilot's airspeed management, degraded by workload and by a situation he had lost track of, together with his control inputs before and during the stall. It named the overweight condition as causal in its own right, because it shrank the room he had to recover. Then it went further up the chain. Bering Air's safety management was inadequate, and had allowed overweight flying to become normal, with manifests that understated what was on board, and the Federal Aviation Authority had not kept pace with the company as it grew. Bering Air has been flying since 1979 and serves 32 villages across western Alaska out of Nome, Kotzebue, and Unalakleet. This was its first fatal crash in 38 years. Since then, it has rewritten its training and dispatch procedures and brought in a mandatory release system that reviews weather and runway conditions before a flight goes, with weight capped whenever icing is possible. Service to the villages resumed a few days after the crash because it had to. In several of them, people gathered at the airstrip and stood in prayer circles to meet the airplanes coming back in. Ted Stevens had already survived one. In December 1978, a small jet came down on landing at Anchorage International Airport in Alaska, killing his wife and 4 other people, and he was one of 2 who walked out of the wreck. 22 years later, the state renamed that airport after him. By 2010, he was 86 and out of office after 40 years in the Senate, the longest-serving Republican in its history and the man who had brought billions of federal dollars home to Alaska. On the 9th of August, he was at a private lodge on the shore of Lake Nurka in the southwest of the state, as the guest of an Anchorage telecommunications company. The plan for the afternoon was salmon fishing at a camp on the Nushagak River, 52 miles southeast. 9 people boarded the airplane, a single-engined de Havilland Otter fitted with amphibious floats. Among them were Sean O'Keefe, the former head of NASA, and his 19-year-old son, and 3 teenagers traveling with their parents. The pilot was 62 and had 28,000 hours. He had flown the same route earlier that day, and people who saw him that afternoon said he was in good spirits. They lifted off the lake at 27 minutes past 2 without filing a flight plan, which is normal for this kind of flying. The weather 18 miles south at Dillingham was marginal, the kind of ceiling that lets a float plane through if the pilot keeps low and knows the country. 15 minutes later, the airplane was 10 miles northeast of Alaknagik, well off the line it should have been flying, and it was climbing in a left turn when it went into a mountainside. It hit tree-covered slope hard enough to tear a gash 300 feet long. The fuselage split open. Stevens, the pilot, and 3 passengers died on the mountain, and the 4 who lived were all seriously hurt. The emergency locator transmitter did what it was built to do and started broadcasting. Then it came loose from its mount in the impact, and the wire running to its antenna snapped, so no satellite ever picked up the signal. A passing airplane spotted the wreck late that afternoon. Eric Shade, who runs an air taxi service out of Dillingham, looked down at the gash on the slope and thought there was no possibility that anyone had lived through it. Then another pilot came up on the radio and said there was a hand waving from a window. A doctor and 2 emergency medical technicians were flown as close as anyone could get and then walked the rest of the way in, reaching the survivors that evening. They stayed on the mountain all night, working on broken bones and cuts in the cold, with the smell of fuel hanging over the wreck the whole time. A 13-year-old boy spent that night beside his father's body and the senator's. A mother and her 16-year-old daughter had died in the same airplane. The National Guard airlifted the 4 survivors off the slope the following morning. The investigation ran into an empty room. The airplane and the engine were both working normally. The weather was poor but flyable, and the pilot had flown that country for decades. The 4 survivors had been sitting where they could not see into the cockpit, so none of them could describe the final minutes. And the airplane carried no recorder of any kind because federal rules did not require one. Investigators worked through every explanation they could construct: fatigue, distraction, the strain of a hard year that included the death of his son-in-law weeks earlier, a seizure, some other medical emergency. Given how far the airplane had strayed from its route, they even examined whether the crash had been deliberate and found nothing to support it. One thing did surface. The pilot had suffered a bleed into the brain in March 2006 and had been cleared to fly again 2 years afterward, and investigators found that the approval process for pilots in that situation was applied inconsistently from doctor to doctor. He had also been seeing a naturopathic practitioner for a facial twitch that got worse when he was tired or under strain, and that had never appeared on his medical applications. In May 2011, the National Transportation Safety Board published its probable cause. The pilot had become temporarily unresponsive for reasons that could not be established from the available information. A man with 28,000 hours stopped flying the airplane for somewhere between a few seconds and a couple of minutes, and nobody has ever been able to say why. The board's recommendations changed the rules. Any pilot who has had a significant stroke now goes through formal cognitive testing before returning to the cockpit. Passengers arriving in Anchorage today land at Ted Stevens International, on the same field where a jet put him in a hospital bed and took his wife in 1978. 95 people boarded at McChord Air Force Base in Washington State on the 3rd of June 1963. Most of them servicemen posted north to Alaska, along with their families. The rest were Defense Department civilians and 1 Red Cross worker. The military had chartered the airplane from Northwest Orient, a Douglas DC-7C with a crew of 6, and the run-up to Elmendorf outside Anchorage was routine enough that the same flight number had been doing it for years. They lifted off at 8 minutes to 8 in the morning and turned up the coast. 2.5 hours later, the crew called in and asked for a different altitude, an ordinary request, and they reported nothing wrong with the airplane. Nobody heard from them after that. The military waited an hour before starting a search, and it took most of the day. At 22 minutes past 7 that evening, a Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft found floating debris in the North Pacific, well out from Annette Island in southeast Alaska, by which time the wreck had been drifting northeast for 9 hours. A Japanese vessel reached the area first and pulled personal baggage and documents out of the water, all of it belonging to someone on board. The Coast Guard took over and worked the site for 4 days, recovering around 1,500 pounds of wreckage from water that sat at about 50 degrees. The only human remains that came up were fragments too small for anyone to be identified, and the ocean kept every one of the 101 people who went into it. The wreckage itself carried more information. The airplane had hit the water at high speed and come apart on impact, and the debris sat in one concentrated patch with nothing floating outside it, which told investigators it had still been in one piece when it struck. They found signs of burning only on material that had caught fire after impact. The seat frames were deformed in a particular direction, with the force applied to the tops of the seat backs, which meant the fuselage had gone into the sea very nearly upside down. The life vests came up still sealed inside their plastic containers. The rest of the airplane was under more than 8,000 feet of water and stayed there. The Navy's Oceanographic Office worked backward from wind and current to calculate where the impact had happened, and that gave the board a point on a chart to go with everything else it did not have. The Coast Guard called off the search in the early hours of the 7th of June. The Civil Aeronautics Board published a short report. Because of a lack of evidence, it was unable to determine the probable cause of the accident. And that sentence is the whole of what 6 months of investigation produced. 101 people went into the Pacific from 14,000 feet on a clear routine transport flight, and the board had a patch of floating aluminium and some ruined seats to work with. There is one more thing in the file. 8 months earlier, in October 1962, another Northwest charter carrying military passengers north had been forced down into the water near Sitka. That airplane ditched successfully, and all 102 people aboard were rescued. It had been operating under the same flight number. Alaska is more than twice the size of Texas, and most of it has no road on it at all. When an airplane goes down out there, finding it is a separate problem from what brought it down, and sometimes a harder one. In 1972, 2 congressmen vanished on a flight to Juneau, and the country mounted the largest search it had ever run. 400 aircraft covering 325,000 square miles over 39 days. They came back empty because the airplane had been flying without a beacon. Congress responded by requiring emergency locator transmitters across most of American general aviation, a small box that switches on at impact and calls for help on its own. 38 years later, a float plane carrying a former United States senator went into a mountainside above Aleknagik. Its beacon fired exactly as designed, then tore loose from its mount and snapped the wire to its antenna, so the signal went nowhere. 4 people survived that impact and spent the night on the slope, while helicopters tried and failed to reach them in the weather. In February 2025, a Cessna Caravan came down on the sea ice of Norton Sound. Its beacon fired too, and it also tore away from its antenna, leaving the Coast Guard with silence on the frequency that was supposed to carry it. 53 years lie between those 2 flights, and the same small box failed the same way in both. The Caravan was found by a radar analysis run by the Civil Air Patrol, whose Alaska volunteers have been flying search missions since before any of this equipment existed. They were part of the 1972 search too. The Alaska Wing puts its average at about 100 lives a year, most of it unglamorous work on overdue airplanes and lost hikers. 2 survivors of the Ketchikan collision were pulled toward shore by a man in a small inflatable boat who had watched the whole thing from the water and simply went. Some of this has improved. Most aircraft now broadcast their position continuously, which is how investigators reconstruct a flight path within hours instead of guessing. Plenty of bush pilots carry personal satellite trackers clipped somewhere in the cockpit. In one Alaskan crash, a passenger climbed out of the wreck, remembered seeing such a device on the pilot's sun visor, dug it out and pressed the button, and his family 200 miles away had the message before any official system did. The terrain has stayed exactly where it was. Norton Sound still freezes over every winter, and the weather that kept helicopters off a hill in 2010 is the same weather that stopped rescuers in 1971 from flying up to the wreck west of Juneau, so National Guardsmen climbed it on foot instead. The airplanes in this video were carrying people doing ordinary things. 2 families going to see bears, a high school swim team, engineers coming home from a water plant, Hunters flying south with the season's catch in the hold. Nobody aboard any of them was doing anything more adventurous than getting from one place in Alaska to another, which in that state means an airplane, because there is no other way. The Civil Air Patrol's Alaska Wing still keeps volunteer crews on call. Somewhere in the state tonight, there is a pilot with a phone by the bed and a flight bag by the door, waiting to be told which direction to start looking. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to Terra Obscura.